welcome to this incredible opportunity to listen in on an amazing conversation. I am so glad that you are here for Simply Sarah. I know that you have busy lives, and the content that we bring for you is stuff that is helpful, gives you food to ponder. And so as we're doing that, I'm going to bring in Dr. Darin Detwiler, who is this week launching on Netflix an incredible documentary called Poisoned: The Dirty Truth About Your Food. And Dr. Detwiler, tell us how you got to this point of being on Netflix.
First off, I am an expert in food safety. I have spent 3 decades now as a food safety advocate, as a food safety policy consultant and professor and an author. And an opportunity came my way to participate in the documentary for Netflix called Poisoned, which looks at an event that took place in 1993 that I was very heavily involved in, and then what has taken place in terms of food safety over the last 3 decades since that event. They used me in two capacities: one as a technical consultant based on my research and based on my first book, Food Safety Past, Present, and Predictions, as well as in front of the camera, talking predominantly throughout the first act about what happened in 1993, and then chiming in on all these different events, outbreaks, and recalls, and changes that have taken place in the 3 decades since.
And it has been exactly 30 years. Would you be willing to share part of that story of how it propelled you into this? Because before this, you were in the U.S. Navy and a nuclear submarine. Thank you so much for your service. And you had also, were a middle school, high school teacher. And then there were some events that radically changed the trajectory of the next 3 decades for you and more.
Yeah, I was 24 years old, and I'm walking this planet as someone with an amount of confidence that was perhaps reflective of the fact that I was supervising the operation of a nuclear propulsion plant on a submarine during the Cold War. And I'm 24. I have this confidence, and like most 24-year-olds, perhaps a bit of invincibility and even immortal elements there. And then a situation happened. It unfolded for my family that, unlike all the training I had in the Navy for, all the times I'd been prepared for handling a situation, I did not know what to do. Um, there was an outbreak of E. coli, and even though there was some evolution of the news at the time, no one had ever really heard of E. coli. The media had never heard of E. coli. They might as well have been saying bird flu or influenza or COVID, whatever, right? And it was associated with food. It was tied to some restaurants that were about an hour and a half south of me in Seattle, and then they were naming the restaurant. And so you say things like, well, let's just not go there, let's just not eat there. And I was more concerned about my then 9-year-old son than I was with my 16-month-old son. But the reality is, go to pick up my 16-month-old son from daycare one day, and there's a notice taped to the door saying that another child had tested positive for E. coli. And it's like, wow, okay, it's close to home, right? Um, that night we saw symptoms in my son. We went to take him to be seen, and what unfolded next was this month-long blur of first learning about E. coli, and I can't explain what's going on to my 16-month-old son. But today I have these memories of sitting there on his hospital bed, holding him on my lap, with tubes and wires, and he was going through renal failure at the time, and he couldn't eat or drink anything. But he saw the IV bag hanging from a pole, and he called for it, saying "Baba," because it was a container of liquid with marks on it, and he wanted normalcy, he wanted comfort. There's that image of him being put onto a helicopter to be airlifted down to Children's Hospital. There's that memory I have of him being dwarfed by wires and tubes and machines and hoses and equipment. This little teeny 16-month-old boy surrounded by equipment they were literally bringing in from other hospitals. And then there's the vision of seeing him again outside the hospital being carried in the smallest white coffin. These are not things I was prepared for. And unfortunately, um, while at the time I thought that science and technology would bring about an end to what I was experiencing, here I am 30 years later, still working in terms of food safety and policy. And some 3,000 families lose someone in America due to foodborne illness every single year. That's some 90,000 other people who've gone through many of those same exact memories and experiences and have those images frozen in time in their minds because of failures in food safety. And like many people, you just don't know what to do in that situation. But I talked to President Bill Clinton the day after my son's death, and we talked father to father, and there was this notion of, well, I'm going to be living, having lost my son, but I don't want to live in a universe where my son loses his father. And so even though I didn't know what to do, I knew that I had the internal fire to do something, to still be a father to my son.
Such a heavy story that has touched so many people's lives. How were you able to take this traumatic tragedy on a national scale, on a national level, with then President Bill Clinton and you having more than one conversation? How were you able to find your way, your path, to what you're doing right now, which is 30 years in, still teaching about food safety? You're at Northeastern University. You have written books. You are loudly sharing your story, and yet you have been living this. What was that? What was that path, that journey for you?
I initially gravitated towards things that I thought I understood and could see as being tangible. I wrote book proposals and sent them to publishers, and they were all returned saying that there's no market for books like this. I was working with TV producers on a TV movie of the week about what had happened. But eventually they canceled the project because there wasn't enough sex and violence to sell it to a mainstream market. And I even wrote about this for the New York Times, and the editorial board, they were like, "Yeah, we need to check on this because there was just this conference over here, this news conference where they said they weren't going to base TV movies on, sex and violence." And so I said, "Well, here's the name and contact information of the people I dealt with. Go talk with them." And they did that and came back and said, "Yeah, they corroborated your story there," and ended up on Good Morning America talking about this. Ended up working with the Secretary of Agriculture as the USDA was working on consumer education elements and new labeling requirements and new testing and other policy elements. They really wanted to bring a very the true burden of disease, a very human side to this wasn't just some kind of automatic reaction out of the blue. There's a real reason behind these changes, and some of those efforts, much like the TV movie and the books, were met with opposition. I had people from the meat industry saying, "How dare you bring an emotional story to the discussion around food policy? How dare you think that it's okay for the government to put a label that says there may be a problem? There's not a problem with meat." And I would point to the fact that there's evidence of the problem. And I, at one point, had someone from the food industry say, "Where's your evidence?" And my response is, "It's 6 feet below the ground. The evidence is there." So, It's not like I snapped my fingers and things just kind of fell into place. It took, I went back to university. I served 2 terms as special advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture. Eventually became a professor. And I did eventually write, I've written 3 books now. My last one being a graphic novel for young adults. Um, I've done various TV shows. I speak um, in front of stages, in front of industry and boardrooms. I write for columns and magazines, and it's just kind of one of those things where I think that I think that there was this conception that the issue is going to go away.
Right.
Why would we still be talking about it? But what we have seen over 30 years is a seemingly endless cycle of failure after failure after failure. It's no longer about meat, it's about everything else now. And just as soon as you think, well, okay, I'll just avoid these foods, there's some new food
Right.
that is, now a culprit in this issue. And there are so many different layers of failures and changes in consumer
Mhm.
behavior. And yet, here's the thing, we all eat. And there are these estimates that the CDC has put out. Some 48 million Americans become sick every year. 128,000 are hospitalized and 3,000 die.
Amazing.
Those estimates have not changed in 3 decades. You would
Yeah.
think that if they had changed even 1%, that the government or the industry would be all over. Look at our success. Look at our success. They haven't changed. So there is just this consistent need to make sure that we do focus on food safety. There is a void when it comes to the idea of consumer seat at the table in a lot of this. And um, the work I've done in academia and in publishing and my 3 decades of work have given me a bit of a credibility to then not only be at that table, but I literally see myself as representing about 100,000 families
Yes.
for whom validation often doesn't exist, for whom voice often does not exist, representation does not exist. And it's not that I'm sitting there trying to say, you know, you guys are bad, you did this, stop doing that. In most cases, my work has evolved to the point where I try to focus on what can I do to shift food safety from being something that needs external motivation to being something we're on a very human and
Yes.
compassionate and emotional level. Food safety work, whoever it is between the farm and the table, whatever job they have, is inspired from within. They have that internal inspiration to focus on food safety, the prioritization, investing in it, training in it, persistence, and
Mhm.
ultimate courage that often goes without validation. And um, it has been something that it's as if every year there's a new dimension to the work that I do. And I still kind of keep coming back to this idea of I don't know what to do,
Mhm.
but I have the drive and I will figure out
Yes.
what to do. And that is what I do.
So, what can we, the consumer, because you're right, it goes all the way from farm to the table, right? So, whether you happen to be eating out or you pick up stuff to take home or you buy all the components and bring it home and are working with, what are things that as the consumer we can be doing to be aware about food safety for ourselves, for our family, for our loved ones?
Um, there's many different levels of a response to this. One is I think that many people can resonate with the idea of um, holding your child's hand when you cross the street, telling them to look both ways before they cross the street, telling them they have to wear their seatbelt before we go driving. This idea of invisible dangers, invisible threats that are out there, and that there are things that we could do. It can't necessarily prevent every single one of them, but it could at least put us in a safer
Right.
position. Things such as, hey, we need to wash our hands before we eat. Hey, we need to wash our hands before we cook. Hey, we need to wash our hands before we unload the dishwasher.
Mhm.
Things like if you're going into a restaurant, a lot of people ask me, are there places that I avoid? Well, if I know a restaurant, if I have a good trust in them, that's one thing. If I'm going to a strange restaurant, it's not so much what food I avoid as it is I will go to the restroom. If the restroom is dirty, I don't even want to know what the kitchen looks like, right?
Right.
Do you remember this phrase, the customer is always right?
Yes.
Remember that?
Whatever happened to that?
Yeah. I stood in front of a large audience of food safety experts one time and said, do me a favor, everyone stand up if you and your not in work, but in your personal life with your family, your friends, whatever, went to a restaurant and saw something that was unhygienic, unsanitary. It was a food safety violation. And like literally everyone stood up. And then I said, please stay standing only if you said something. And the amount of people that sat down was staggering, and the audible response from the people in the audience, because it's like, well, I don't want to like not be able to go to that restaurant again, or I don't want to embarrass someone, or I don't want to create a scene or whatever. But it's like, look, I think another message is, if we see something and that's wrong and we don't say anything and we pay the restaurant, essentially we're voting with our money. We're saying it's okay for you to cross contaminate. It's okay for it to be undercooked. It's okay for this to be dirty. It's okay, for whatever it is, right? And our history in this country changed um, in about 2015, I believe, 2012, 2015. The US Bureau of Labor and Statistics collected this data. I don't know if you know this, but right around that time, for the first time in American history, Americans were spending more food money on food that's prepared outside of the home than they were on food that's being prepared inside the home.
Yes.
So with that becomes this idea that we are trusting more people externally than we are just trusting ourselves. We have to be able to trust ourselves. We also have to be able to trust the people outside. This involves everything from, the reputation, what is the labeling, what is, do we know who we're getting our food from? Do we know who's preparing our food? These things might sound like, well, that's a lot. But I tell you, if you're a family with a young child who has a serious food allergy and could literally die if there's peanuts in it, and you're just trusting some teenager who's working the front counter at a restaurant who's like, oh yeah, it's good, you might want to ask more questions. If you are a family that has someone who's in the most vulnerable populations, they're very young. Most hospitalizations and deaths are children under 5. They're very elderly. Those are the compromised immune system, and those who are pregnant. These, when we look at after incident reports, after an outbreak is concluded, the CDC statistics tells us that these are the people who are in the hospital, who have confirmed cases, who are dealing with severe lifelong medical complications, or who die. It is the healthy adults who are, it's just an inconvenience. And these are also the ones who are ironically the most democratically involved. Those people who are the most vulnerable often are not the ones who are making the decisions around what food is purchased, where the food is purchased, how it's prepared. So we have to think about that in our households. The idea of, if we just take care of those who are healthy, that's one thing. But if we take into consideration the needs of those most vulnerable populations, they're also going to benefit us who may be perfectly healthy, because food safety, increasing food safety for all, it's just not when it's convenient. It has to be comprehensive. So there's a lot of messaging around food safety at the home that we need to take into consideration. What foods we buy, where we buy these foods, how these foods are prepared, what we do with these foods, how we treat leftovers, preventing cross-contamination. There's so many things involved in it. And it's not meant to be like unsurmountable as much as it is, let's just include it in the conversation. And there's a lot of other things that we can go through, a lot of steps to make sure that are done right. Food is one of those things we have to make sure is done right.
Wow, you have given so much information and just opened the doors. I mean, for me, there were pieces about this because I have been in education where you go into the cafeteria and there are very specific things. And if you get lucky enough to be able to go into the back of the cafeteria where they're working on the food, you get to see all the different labels and those kinds of pieces that are in there. But also to notice the number of parents who make sure that their child has a packed lunch or lunch from home. And then over the last several years, to notice the number of tables. It used to be just kind of a little bit a part of one table kind of a thing for kids with allergies, that they would go sit there. And now that has just grown to see so many more kids who either have allergies or whose parents are concerned about allergies or potential pieces that are coming forward with that. And so I have personally seen that part grow. And yes, I did know that we had that switch. I have family that work in food, and they had were very excited about what their company at the time was building up and working on, because so many more people were buying foods that were partially prepared. You could finish it off at home kind of a thing, right? And so they were super excited about the new things that were coming out with that. And I found myself just kind of thinking about, at what point do I make the decision about how much time and effort I'm going to put into what I'm choosing to eat? And do I actually wash all of the berries, even when they say that they're organic? You know, do I make the time to do all those different pieces and just be much more present in the kitchen? It has caused a lot for us as a family to have a lot of conversations about what these pieces look like, in part because I grew up in a third world country. And when we brought lettuce home, the lettuce always went into eau de javel water, which was bleached water. And it had to sit there for a period of time. And then, yes, it was washed off with water that had been boiled and then purified and all the different things, right? I mean, multiple steps just to eat something, lettuce that was fresh. Bananas, not so much, because they have the outside, right? You can wash it, you're off you go. And so for me, I'm always surprised and yet not. I'm saddened each time I see that there's another outbreak on something. Particularly, it seems to be on spinach and on lettuce and, you know, some of the leafy kinds of things. I think it's on other things as well. But things that if you are going to have a higher roughage, fresh kind of life, right, eating those kinds of things, that's typically the place in the grocery store that you reach for, or that when you go out to eat, that you choose a salad over, you know, the big pasta dish and those kinds of pieces. Are there foods that you have found to be safer, if that's a way of saying it, or more reliable? That's a better way. Are there foods that you have found that have been more reliable if somebody were to go out to eat, like a hot soup? Is that going to be more reliable than a cold salad?
You know, I avoided red meat for about 20 years after my son's death, but it got to a point where if I was to avoid all foods, then there was nothing left. You know, one of the most deadly outbreaks tied to food in U.S. history killed 33 people. Um, um, that it wasn't even 20, 25 years ago. Do you know what the food was? This might shock you. Do you have any idea what it was? 33 people died as a result of this outbreak.
I want to say it was a dairy product.
It was cantaloupe.
Really?
Yeah. I don't eat cantaloupe. The pH balance, and you cannot actually clean the outside. And if you bring a knife through it, whatever was on the outside is now on the inside, and it grows rapidly. But there are so many other foods that you know, at one point or another, I've raised questions about, and I think that it's easy. It'd be easy to just say avoid this. The reality is there are behaviors, there are conditions, there are issues that are associated with every food. Every food, even if you look at the idea of like cell cultured or lab grown meats,
Yes.
or plant based meats, they can still be cross contaminated with other meats and other foods. So even foods like that, there's no guarantee in terms of food safety. But I think if we start looking at behaviors and start thinking about food differently, you know, I was a high school, middle school teacher for 16 years. And I talk with my students about the fact that we have to think about food not only in terms of history and politics and society, but we have to think about food as part of our fabric of life. The idea of coming of age, right? We would look at the idea of the teenager who wants their independence. They want money. What do they want to do? They want to go out and eat. They want to get a car. What do they want to do? They want to go to the drive-in. They need a job. 51% of all first jobs have something to do with food. They're going to
Yes.
go off to college. Where parents are going to worry about, are they getting enough food? They're going to move out on their own. Of course, are they getting enough food? They
Yes.
get they become a parent, and then now you're worried about the children being safe and having food. You look at the young parent who's freaking out about their kid going off to school because, like you were talking about, the idea of food allergies and food at school kind of a thing. So one way, shape, form, or another, food is part of our fabric of life.
Yes.
But when I talk with industry, I point out that everyone who works in the food industry is also a consumer and has a family. So it's not like there's the worker pool and then there's a consumer pool, and never in a Venn diagram of the
Right.
world do these two
Yes.
don't intersect. So we
Mhm.
have to look at, so then what are the behaviors, and what are the those kind of like corporate social responsibilities, and those Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we somehow have to remind people about. That I'm glad that you're giving bonuses and raises and giving people the ability to do this up here as a bonus for the work they do. Meanwhile, you're paying them way too low. And meanwhile, what about food safety down here? Because if you are not able to afford food, and if you are sick, then you're not able to even worry about these other levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's just crazy that I spend so much of my time talking before industry leaders, weaving in stories about not only my family, my son, the other families who I've worked with over the course of my career, but stories and explaining about, again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, corporate social responsibility, change theory, uh, analytic tools like SWOT analysis, understanding likelihood and severity, and what does severity really mean. Um, the true burden of disease. You have to have a multidisciplinary and a comprehensive view of some of these more complicated issues. And even with all this, there are still times where I'm faced with this notion of, I don't know what to do, but that doesn't stop me. And I keep pushing forward, and I will find a way, or I will come into contact with someone who has a solution, and I will help that person build, nurture, and whether it's market or communicate whatever that solution or the process. So um, it becomes this idea of learning how to be a self advocate, not in terms of food safety, but for me as a business. And also, even learning entrepreneurial skills in terms of the idea of taking this idea. When you start looking at the books and the articles and the columns and the Netflix documentary, these things don't just mysteriously land on your doorstep. You have to put yourself out there. You have to network. You have to build that credibility. You have to build those skills, and you have to be agile enough to flex with these different needs. And
Yes.
but all that being said, you still have to be clear in terms of what is your mission. Because I've had different jobs, I've had different careers, I've had different job titles, I've had different employers. Um, but my mission was always clear and consistent. And through all that, that is how we have a lot of the work by a lot of great people in this country that have been done by staying clear to, in this case, a mission of wanting to prevent as many parents as I can from living with that chair forever empty at their family table.
Yes. Oh, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about why you chose to call it the Herculean effort. We'll be right back after this.
We've been on a CR and been telling everyone about it since about 5 months ago. Right away, my body experienced a mini detox. I experienced full, deep nights of sleep till this day. Hair growth, if you knew my hair before, as well as physical stamina.
I can testify to that. I use my brain a lot, and I've noticed an increase in mental clarity and mental stamina.
That's so true. And our skin feels the healthiest it's ever been, guys. And to be honest with you, we do feel younger, and we're getting so many compliments. So I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to learn more about ASEA. Feel free to book a 30-minute call with me. See you soon.
I so appreciate Dr. Darin Detwiler taking time to be with us today and have this conversation. I think we might be his 5th conversation today, and there's still another one afterwards. That's how busy he is, and that he found time for Simply Sarah to come in and share with us. I'm just so deeply grateful. I'm also grateful for Cindy Tier, who's the person who said, Sarah, I just spent some time listening to Dr. Darin Detwiler, and you need to have him on the show because what he is sharing is something that everybody needs to hear. So grateful for that. So as we bring him back in, part of this conversation is I would love to have you share why you call it the Herculean effort, because you went back and took a Greek god to say this is how important and how big and how serious foodborne illnesses are.
So this, I think, is one of those stories that evolved over time. I had read, Upton Sinclair's 1906 book, The Jungle. Most people have said they know of it. They haven't read it, but they know of it, or at least they know the 2 chapters that talk about the horrible conditions back then, right? And so there were 2 things that were happening about the same time for me. One was that I had met a family whose 4-year-old son got sick from E.coli and was in the hospital under dialysis. And while under dialysis, had a stroke and ended up losing the ability to lose his left arm. About 4 years later, 4 or 5 years later, met up with the family again. I happened to be in their town for a conference, and the mom had shared with me a drawing that her son made, and it was this crayon drawing of a superhero in flight. I'm talking cape, the red cape and the tights and the superhero pose kind of a thing. And she was saying how he talks often about not being able to play like the other children in the playground at school, and that he wishes that someone in the food industry had done something or said something that could have prevented this from happening to him, and that person would be a hero. And this is what he drew, this superhero in flight. It wasn't someone in a suit or a lab coat or a hairnet, beard net, a name tag, a briefcase, things you might associate with food safety. Literally, in this world of Marvel and DC superhero TV shows and movies, drew someone who was worthy of wearing a cape.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, for a 8 or 9-year-old kid who will live with, forever bearing the mark of a failure in food safety, to think of that's how important people who work in food safety should be conceived, right? But I ended up happening across this London Daily Times 1906 literary review. It's like a book review of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And it talked, before it got into the book itself as a piece of literature, it talked about the real world implications of the book. And it said that the things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday and are happening today and will happen tomorrow and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. That has stuck with me for a long time. But I think that it's my interpretation that it's not about a Hercules. There's no such thing as any one magic bullet, one person Hercules. Kind of like that idea of it takes a village, if you will.
Yes.
But I think of it as a poetic way of saying that food safety requires a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work and strength. And we can find that with technology and policy and science and data and all these different things. But the third thing is the most critical: work, strength, and courage. Courage to remain persistent. Courage to place consumer safety over return on investment or cost benefit and analysis, courage to be mindful of the needs of food safety every day, every shift, every product, courage to gain other training or certifications, to go to events, to speak up, to place food safety as such an important factor, even above all the disruptions, like changes in consumer behavior and new products and new types of distribution or whatever, internet, whatever it is, right? But the idea of having that courage, because without courage, you can have all the data in the world, but you need to turn that data into actionable information. You need to
Yes.
follow up on that. You need to test things. You need to ask the right questions. You need to pull the right people together. You need to make decisions that sometimes do not sound like the most financially obvious decision. But if you have the courage to say, yes, this may cost $19,000 for us to throw away these olives, but a recall could cost us $10 million, and we don't even want to try to put a number to the idea of the cost of consumers being harmed, and the idea that yes, our company can rebound from an incident, but can those consumers who are harmed, can those families easily rebound from these things? So it takes a lot of courage, I think. And we can go to conferences and read books about all the technologies and the science and all that kind of stuff. You can get degrees and all that stuff, but who's there focusing on the courage behind this? So that is where an effort comes in. And this is one of the things I talk about with my audiences, that idea of these, I think of it as or I talk about it as the 4 Cs. The first C being customer safety or consumer safety. The second C being the corporate responsibility or the collaborative responsibility behind it. The third C being the courage that it takes to do this. And that fourth C being that cape that people don't wear, but how even kids who will forever bear the mark of failure in food safety actually see the people who day in and day out make sure that food is as safe as it can be, even though they'll never necessarily know, like there's someone clicking, you just saved these many
Yes.
people or whatever.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
they are worthy of wearing a cape. And if we focus on those 4 Cs, I think that quite honestly, um, as an industry, the food industry will start to see that it's a little easier to nurture and validate the courage, to have these conversations, to understand the true burden of disease, to understand why we have prioritized and invested in food safety, and why our food safety legacy within the food industry um, needs to have a solid compass. Not just looking in terms of where can we find that for the last 30 years, but what are we going to do for the next 30 years?
Yeah.
Because in the year 2053, 30 years from now, whoever's at the helm of a lot of these companies are not going to even have been born in 1993 when the start of what we have today really took place.
I'm still mulling over the fact that we haven't moved the needle at all in America and we consider ourselves to be a first world country with all of the different technologies that we have. What's the one thing that you believe that would move that needle in terms of the percentage of people who get sick every single year from a foodborne illness? What's the one thing that we as consumers could be asking for or looking for or voting with our money on that would make a difference that you feel?
Well, a good point in that the numbers haven't changed, but I think that the landscape has become so much more difficult that if it wasn't for the hard work and that Herculean effort and the technologies of so many people, that perhaps those numbers would be worse today. But I think that if consumers continue to grow as stakeholders within the entire food system, if consumers as stakeholders demanded transparency, demanded that more effort be put into building and justifying the growth and the reputation of companies, that perhaps educated consumers can take actions in that last mile of food's journey, which is also the last mile of food safety's journey, and be more proactive in what they do and what they demand and what they ask and what they look for in terms of food safety. I don't want this to be construed as the responsibility falls onto solely the shoulders of consumers. But again, consumers are the pool from which workers come, and consumer demand is what will change, and voting with their money as well is what will have an impact on industry to improve the food safety, and their validation and their efforts to make sure that it's truly safe.
I think one of the things that I've noticed since we've come back from the shutdown, that some of those pieces of the shutdown have stayed like with buffets and that kind of thing, where it's very, very, everything is super compartmentalized and everything is really, people are checking the ice, they're checking the temperature, they're checking those kinds of pieces. And that was something that years ago I chose to not be eating at a smorgasbord because I just didn't know, right? And still today, that's not necessarily my favorite. If I'm super hungry and my blood sugar is moving in a way that I need to do something, I will find what I need to do to make that happen. But I also am just grateful that there are some pieces out of what was so difficult for so many people and so difficult for so many restaurants as well. And even now, finding workers to come in and be consistent in their working, and with people who are tired, for them still to be washing their hands, still to be showing up, still to make sure they're covering the food, still making sure that they're in the right place in the refrigerator or in the freezer, all those labeling and all the different pieces, just being grateful for that, for people who are doing that. And I guess I see this from a very different perspective as we're getting deeper into this conversation about, I haven't been as vocally appreciative to people who are checking to make sure that those pieces are taken care of. And, sometimes their personalities are very black and white, but they are perfectly in place because their personalities are so black and white that if this is not the right temperature, if you didn't do this particular procedure, then this can't go forward. And I love what you said about the reputation for the company, because I think that throwing out $19,000 worth of olives or whatever the X product might be, by choosing to do that and not tell the consumer, yes, there is a loss on the bottom line with that. And yet that whole idea of protecting from a place of being right, so this is going to be a different way of using the word righteous, but being right in that righteousness of that they have done it to protect their name, knowing that the people who are using the product at the end are the ones who are the consumers, who are the ones who need to be healthy. And I again appreciate you bringing out that it's the younger children and it's the older, the pregnant, the people who are vulnerable medically, that we saw take such a direct hit in different flus that have come across the country and different things that have come across the world. And to notice that again, this is something that we can't just go to the hospital and expect them to fix us. That's not how this works. Our bodies have to be part of this process as well, of taking in the nutrients and doing the right things with it in order for our bodies to continue to work. And so I guess I'm kind of wandering in my thoughts out loud, but I really appreciate how you are shaping the canvas here.
Well, there's three things you explored here that I think are of note. One is that, that theoretical, whatever it was, $19,000 of olives, throwing it out, as opposed to the idea of harming your consumers. The throwing out of $19,000 of any ingredient should be the cost of doing business, not people becoming sick is the cost of doing business. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is the world I live in. And that is a world that so many people work in when we're talking with leadership. Two, is that the pandemic, when there was people talking about, look, I'm a healthy American adult, I should have the right to wear a mask or not. It's those very young, the elderly, those with compromised immune systems, and those who are pregnant that really didn't have the ability to have a choice in terms of wearing a mask or not. Sometimes we have to take into consideration the needs of those most vulnerable populations over the needs of the healthy adult kind of a thing, especially when it comes to convenience. But finally, one of the things that you were really reflecting on is, there was a time where when it came to food, the only questions we asked was, is it the taste that I want? Is it enough to make me feel full? And can I afford it?
Right.
When I was a kid, for me, the only question I asked was, what's the toy inside the cereal box? Kind of a thing. But
Yes.
today, consumers ask so many more questions, about food quality. Is it the quality that I want? About food safety. Is it safe? Whether that is an allergen or a contaminant, like E. coli, salmonella. There's questions about food defense. Like, is it free from sabotage? There are, you've heard things like the people that fill a bottle full of their urine and spray it over the veggie counter or the produce display at a grocery store, or worse, intentional adulteration, even bioterrorism.
Right.
There's questions around food security, as in, which sounds like food defense, but food security is like sustainability and access, and is there actual nutritional value in what I'm eating? And then finally, food authenticity, counterfeit, people saying that it's this, but it's not actually that, or it's, it looks like it's honey, but it's really, corn syrup and flavors added to it, kind of a thing. Or
Right.
it says it's from France, but it's really from New Jersey, kind of a thing. And it might sound like some of these are kind of petty, but in the bigger sense of these things, again, when we're voting with our money, it should be what it says on the label. If it says that it's free of X, Y, and Z, it should be free of X, Y, and Z. If it
Yes.
says that it includes X, Y, and Z, it should include X, Y, and Z. If it says that it has this certification or meets the requirements for this, it should actually do this.
Yes.
And we live in a world where that's taken for granted because we think it's convenient to, but that convenience also means that people take advantage of it. And when people take advantage of it, typically it's for economic gain, and typically, like you see in the trailer for the Poison movie, where there's these newly hatched chicks that are kind of going off of a conveyor belt. That's not what consumers are supposed to be. We're not supposed to be another, just another dollar that's sitting on the conveyor belt and quote unquote the cost of doing business. We should be true stakeholders. We should be asking the right questions. We should be demanding validation and transparency, and all true and valid efforts for companies to be accurate and honest in what they do.
What I hear you asking and presenting both is integrity. You're asking for people who are in the food business, farm to table, to have integrity. But you're also sharing that this is a standard that we can be having conversations about. And I think integrity as a business person also goes way outside of the conversation about food. Obviously, your son's death has truly helped shape the work that you are doing, the legacy that you are leaving, the people that you are training at the university level who are now in state and federal positions. And so having heard your perspective and have had time with you to be able to ask questions and to be able to mull through how do we implement these things at the state or federal level. With this, choosing that space of integrity. So your life has been about this, starting again with you being in a United States Navy nuclear submariner, that part of that training had to do with integrity, and that you've carried that all the way through the work that you are continuing to serve all of Americans with the work that you were doing. And not just that, Dr. Detwiler, you are traveling around the globe and you are talking to people in other countries and sharing with them as well this process. What is the one thing that you want viewers of this new movie called Poison, what do you want them to walk away with clearly, actively doing differently?
I introduce a phrase in the documentary that I hear quite often, and it just drives me crazy when I hear it. When I hear executives, leaders, policymakers, elected officials say that America has the safest food supply in the world, what I hear that being talked about as an excuse, not as a mission driving something that we have to uphold. Um, we were talking about being educators, and um, I used to teach at-risk and special needs students, but later in my career, I taught talented and gifted students.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how many times talented and gifted students and parents would make statements that were indicative of the fact that, oh, but my child's talented and gifted. They don't have to do all that kind of a thing. It's they shouldn't be expected to go above and beyond or whatever. And I'm like, if anything, you should be expected to go above and beyond. And so, yeah, I pushed my students to go above and beyond. But here's the deal. I didn't just push my talented and gifted students to go above and beyond. I also pushed my at-risk and special needs students to go above and beyond, because if we don't put 100% into learning, working, parenting, whatever, right? How are we going to expect to get 100% out? And if I, as the teacher, as the professor, as the consultant, the speaker, the advocate, the advisor, whatever, if I don't put 100% into it, then how am I going to expect to get 100% out of those who participate in those opportunities to improve upon the world of food safety? So I don't know if I was trained in integrity, or if because of my level of integrity, I'm someone who qualified to be one of a very small percentage of people who served on a submarine operating a nuclear reactor. And then, I took it off so quickly. I took off that uniform so quickly right when my son died. But I didn't have to wear that uniform to be of service and to be a person of integrity and to figure out that there is a way to move forward. Now, mind you, I'm saying that you don't have to wear a cape to be a hero in the eyes of those who are looking for you in terms of your food safety Herculean effort. But I think you're right. What I talk about, what I do, and what I teach is far more than just food. When I teach about corporate social responsibility and about international field study, or when I teach about sustainable development or international consulting, a lot of it has to do with integrity and with responsibility and with even DEI and multiple perspectives and understanding all these elements in a very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to the idea of, look, if we want to make a difference, if we want to be part of change, not change just when it's inconvenient, and not just change when you're literally in crisis mode, but the idea that change is an inevitable part of sustaining our roles in life and to sustaining our roles in our career, and the idea of healthy approach to what we do and how we interact with those people around us, whether they're below us, above us, or alongside of us. We have to be able to focus on bringing about these changes, and that requires us to understand about this process. And so there's so many times where is it my experience that's shaping what I teach? Is it my experience that shapes what I do? Or is it what I do that actually shapes my own personal experience? Because there's been many times where I'll sit and I'll get stuck with something and it just hits me. I need to listen to my own messages because I have just dropped the ball personally about something that I've explained a way forward to my students or to my audiences. And I totally get it. It's very easy to lose track of some of these foundational level things. But if you remain in a mindset of communication is a two-way street, and even learning is a two-way street, it's not just the people I teach, but it's what I learn from them. Then again, healthy, sustainable, personal and professional outlook.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for enlightening us, for sharing. We will absolutely be watching Poisoned. Thank you, Dr. Darin Detwiler, for being with us. And this concludes this week. Thank you.